So, hello everyone. Hello everyone. Thank you for praising Miami traffic and welcome everyone to our annual EU Jean Monnet Center conference here at FIU. My name, if you don't know me yet, is Marcus Thiel. I'm a professor in the Department of Politics and International Relations here at FIU, and I direct the EU's Jean Monnet Center of Excellence, which is funnily enough not on here, here at FIU. So the EU grant that we got from the European Union focuses on issues of social inclusion and diversity. So we wanted to also, because it is very timely, organize a conference on the topic of democratic values and civic participation in Europe, but also beyond. Just to give you a little bit of data, that's what academics do, right? Why this may be important for us. As of last year, 2024, only 45% of the world lives in what can be classified as a democracy, according to the major indices, the VDEM, the Economist's Democracy Index, Freedom House, and so on. That's down from previous decades. But also, the quality of democratic governance in countries has decreased, right? And the number of democratizing countries, meaning the ones that slowly transition to a democracy now, is half what it was 20 years ago, 18. Whereas the number of autocratizing countries, meaning the ones that revert back from democracy, doubled to 42. So you can see here, even in an international comparison, right? It's not looking so great, so we need to talk about this. So historically, it's somewhat ironic or sad that the idea of modern liberal democracy, which once was a dangerous idea, right, for many of the European 19th century monarchs, that then became sort of the established norm in our globalized 20th century. And now it is imperiled again by increasing authoritarianism here in the US, in Europe, and elsewhere, but also by the complacency and intolerance of individuals, because we've become so used to, seeing only our view. Maybe also the cancel culture, restricting open debate, but also the surveillance through new technology, the inequality of unfettered capitalism, and the political polarization that we all know that's in part being advanced by social media. So that's domestically, but also in a broader picture, as I mentioned earlier, democracy is challenged globally by new transnational challenges to which individual states have a hard time responding to. Think of environment, think of issues such as migration, think of global geopolitics. And when we think of global geopolitics, Anne Applebaum's Autocracy Incorporated, her book, right, the recent bestseller, best exemplifies this when she says, we increasingly have a transnational global network of autocrats working together with oligarchs, sounds familiar, right, that also work on decreasing democracies around the world. So it's not just a domestic issue, but what I'm trying to say, it's also an international issue. And so we're trying to unpack that over the next day or day and a half. But our invited experts, and tomorrow we have a whole full day of panels with policy experts, academics, and consuls. They will tell us more about it. We're excited to open today the keynote with a keynote lecture by Dr. Walter Goetz. He's a director of the European Parliament Liaison Office in Washington D.C. And so he came, thank you very much, he came down to be from D.C. to be with us. But before we begin, I just want to thank the European Commission for funding our research and outreach activities, especially in times like these, as well as our collaborative partners here at FIU, especially our Dean, Shlomi Dinar, and our Senior Director for Strategic Initiatives, Pedro Botta. Thank you very much. I also want to thank our co-sponsors, the European and Eurasian Studies Program, the Dorothea Green Lecture Series, the Maurice Ferré Institute for Civic Leadership, the Jorge Perez Metropolitan Center, the Wolfsonian Public Humanities Lab, the Department of Politics and International Relations, and the Václav Havel Program for Human Rights. A particular thanks goes to my right hand, Madame Christine Kali, and our student assistants, without whom this would not run so smoothly. And I want to recognize the consuls and any community guests that are here tonight. Thank you very much for making the trip out to FIU. And of course, our keynote speaker and our guests that we'll hear more about it tomorrow. I want to hand it over to our special guest speaker, Dr. Walter Goetz, who will set now the stage in the next 15-20 minutes about how the European Parliament works, how it works in promoting democracy transnationally. And then I'm engaging him in a few questions, and then you have the chance to debate or discuss or ask questions. Dr. Walter Goetz, just to introduce him, I don't know, Christine, do I have to?
I think it's somewhere there.
Yes, I just need to wait here. So, here, right? He was appointed head of the European Parliament Liaison Office in D.C. on September 1st, 2023, and served previously in a number of important functions as head of secretariats. So he was really involved at the top level European decision-making, not only with regards to the DG Transport, also the Committee on Industry, Research and Energy, Transport and Tourism, the Special Committee on the Financial Economic Crisis. I mean, you probably can talk about everything, so this is why your visit is particularly valuable. His career began in the German Federal Ministry of Finance in Bonn and Berlin in the years 1998 to 2003, where he held various positions as a desk officer. And he studied law and administrative sciences in Konstanz in Speyer, Germany, and holds a PhD from the Faculty of Law of the University of Konstanz in Germany. That being said, thank you very much for being here, and the floor is all yours.
Okay. Thank you so much, dear Markus. Thank you so much also to Christine Kali for hosting us and organizing us today in the run-up of this conference. I say thank you also to Pedro Botta, Professor Botta, for on behalf of the SIPA faculty. Thank you so much. It's a great honor for me to be here tonight and to speak a little bit about the European Parliament. As Markus was saying, the topic of your conference is democratic value and civic participation in Europe and beyond. I think actually that the European Parliament, I move this on, here's the picture of our plenary hall in Strasbourg. We have two plenary sessions, one is in Brussels and one is in Strasbourg. The main seat is in Strasbourg. This is our European Parliament. It's quite, I think, striking to talk about the European Parliament if you want to have a model of transnational democratic institution, because the European Parliament is actually the only transnational parliament in the world that I know which has a directly elected parliament and has a legislative power which leads to the adoption of laws which are directly binding for citizens, enterprises, and courts and administrations in our 27 member states. This is shown here just very roughly. Some of you are studying the EU institutions. So we have the European Parliament and the European Council, which is composed out of member states' representatives, the ministers actually, and they act on behalf of a proposal by the European Commission, which is the triangle of legislation. Why I'm putting this up? Because the European Parliament adopts these laws which are binding, whereas an international organization such as the UN system, they would not adopt legislation. They do resolutions or international treaties, which later on needs ratification in the respective member states. And then you have a different level of democratic accountability that comes then from the democratic system of the participation members states, whereas in the European Union, we have a democratic decision-making, democratic value and civic participation through this directly elected European Parliament. We have in the European Parliament, we had elections last year in June. We have 720 members of European Parliament. It's quite big, but we also have some 400 million citizens in the European Union, so it's also a large area to cover. And we have 8 groups in the European Parliament, which are a little bit in what we call the camembert cake here, visualized here. those groups together are the decision-making body. The largest group, as you can see, is the European People's Party with almost 190 members. Then we have on the left side of this political spectrum, the Renew Europe, which is a liberal group with 77 members. We have the Greens, and a large portion is the Socialists and Democrats, and also the left. And on the right side, further right from the EPP, we have the European Conservatives and Reformists. Then we have the Patriots for Europe and the European Sovereign Nations, and we have also a few members who are non-attached, non-affiliated to political groups. That's the so-called non-inscrits, non-attached members. If you want to see how this is composed in the member states, I mean, the European Parliament, as it's a transnational parliament, 720 members. We have 27 member states. So not each state has the same amount of members, because we try to align this with the number of people living in those states. So you can see Germany has 96, whereas Malta, Luxembourg, and Cyprus have only 6 members of parliament, European Parliament. It's roughly, but not directly comparable. If you were to a mathematical formula, you will have in Malta only 2, and in Germany maybe 120 or 150, but that would not give a good composition of the European Parliament. So it's a compromise. But there you can see these 720 members from 27 states. They work, they speak in total 24 languages. The working language evidently is English, or it's French to a large extent, but plenary sessions and legislation is translated into 24 languages. So we are truly multinational parliament. This is also something for students here to understand. If you have an international organization like the United Nations, that has, I think, something like 180 states, you can say we have 7 working languages, or 9, I don't know. I think the United Nations has something like 7 languages. And you translate everything only in 7 languages. Fair enough. Why? Because the texts which are adopted by the General Assembly in the United Nations have no direct binding nature. They need to be transposed by ratification in each of these 180 member states of the United Nations national legal systems. So you have then the democratic accountability through the national systems. Our laws are directly binding. And I cannot have citizens in Malta being bound by a legislation which is adopted in Strasbourg if he or she cannot read that legislation. So that means it has to be translated also, the written texts, into Maltese and all the other languages which are composed of here. This is quite important, I think, because of this binding nature of our legislation. Let me see. The European Parliament is composed out of committees. I mean, I don't go too much in that, but it's very similar to the US Congress, of course. We have a number of committees. We have currently upgraded the subcommittee on defense to a standing committee. That is something which I could maybe come back in the discussion. The Parliament has a calendar, as it's very similar to the congressional calendar. We go with the long calendars. For you who goes to Strasbourg soon, I just was looking in the calendar. In that 4th week of July, when you're going to Strasbourg, it's a so-called Green Week, which the members are not in Strasbourg. They will be in external parliament activities. Actually, some of those members are come actually to Washington D.C. in that moment. I should come back to this slide here, I think. Let me talk a little bit about how the European Parliament works, and maybe I should then go actually to this slide here. This one here. We are not like the US Congress, a parliament which has, in the US you have only 2 parties and the majority runs the show, the winner takes it all, and the minority basically has only a ranking member role and has to wait when the next elections turns over the majority. The European Parliament has a system where we work very much along compromise finding and about integrating political opinions as far as possible across the political spectrum. We don't support the government, the European Parliament, as we are not a state, we are a supranational organization. We don't support the government. I mean, the European Commission president is elected by the European Parliament, the legislation is elected by the Parliament, we hold the Commission on account, but we are not at the receiving end in supporting by any majority of the European Commission action. So we don't have coalition building in the European Parliament in general terms. But if a legislation is proposed, let's say new emission standards for cars, and a CO2 mandate for cars, and it goes to our Parliament, then a committee is in charge to draft a report, amendments to that legislative proposal, and then at some point in time it comes to a vote in plenary in the European in the European Parliament, and then the rapporteur, what we call of that bill, could be a member from the S&D group or EPP group, whatever, would propose then amendments and a voting list. But in the end, all members of Parliament vote equally, one member, one vote, and often we find then also a little bit by hazard or by political dynamics, sometimes majorities which tend to be more on the right side or more on the left side. So we don't have this absolute predictability of a government coalition supporting a government and an opposition never finding a majority. In contrary, the European Parliament is a parliament where historically the best solution, the best negotiation tactic, the best compromise finding leads to good results. There you can find majority if members go across the political spectrum and try to seek majority for their ideas. This is something which is unique in the European Parliament. It is this compromise finding across 27 member states, cultural backgrounds and political needs, and 8 groups. These are the groups of the European Parliament, but behind a group like the EPP, you might have something like, I don't know, 50 or 60 national groups, because even Germany has the CDU and the CSU, and both are in the EPP group. So you can see the EPP group is one group in the European Parliament, but deals with maybe 40 national parties in 27 member states. So we are quite a complex political system. Maybe I should say a few words about what are the main challenges now after the elections and our main political challenges, and then I stop here and I leave it more to Markus to come in with his questions and also to give you the chance to bring in your comments and questions. The European Parliament has shifted a bit to the right in the last elections in June 2024, namely that you can see here that all groups which are EPP and for the right are composing a majority. The left groups do not compose a majority anymore. This is of lesser relevance like you have it in the US Congress, as I just said, but it's still a matter of fact that the political spectrum moved in the European Parliament more to center-right political groups. This is here and there in the future will be of relevance when we come to votes on political issues which have been historically very tight in the policy making of the European Parliament. To come back to an example which I know very well, like for instance environmental legislation when it comes to the CO2 standards for cars, for the combustion engines, when the outgoing Parliament has decided that by 2035 in Europe there shall be no CO2 emissions anymore on cars, which in the end is a ban of the combustion engine, which is basically, with current technologies, a mandate to go electric or hydrogen only. That vote was carried very tight in July 2023. There were only some 15 or 20 members out of 720 in favor more than against in that legislation. This is one of the topics where we might see some changes in the next 5 years to come, when majorities shift a little bit towards the right on issues like environmental legislation or legislation affecting societal issues or, let's say, economic issues in general. But it's not to be expected that we see major revolutionary shifts in the European Union policy making, because everything what the European Parliament does depends on a proposal from the European Commission. So if the European Commission is not proposing legislation and is not proposing to amend a CO2 standards for cars regulation, the European Parliament itself cannot do anything. I mean, we can adopt resolution, we can have discussion, we can do hearings, but we would not be able to change the law. So the process is very long in the European Parliament compared to the US system, when sometimes bills can be done very fast. In the European Parliament, a typical legislative cycle is at least 1 year, Commission proposal, first reading in the Parliament, first reading in the Council, then the negotiations between the two co-legislators, and then you have normally a full year until implementation. Regulations can enter into force immediately, but directives need to be transposed in member states level. So we have a fairly slow, compared to the US side, to take your country as an example, a fairly slow legislative cycle. A few words about the topics which the European Parliament is mainly focused on now. That is, as you can imagine, of course, with security and defense. The Ukraine situation, which is a war at our eastern flank, eastern border. The Ukraine itself is, in the meantime, an accession country. So they are also negotiating with the European Union the terms and conditions for any future, at some point in the future, accession to the European Union. Another issue which is high on the agenda now, I mentioned it already as example, is the whole competitiveness. The European economy is not doing that well. In the last years, we have a very low growth rate compared to other regions in the world. Unemployment is not too high, but it's stable. There we still have unemployment, and we have higher and higher costs for our companies, costs coming from taxes, from regulation, and sometimes also attracting talent and these kind of things. So making the European economy more competitive is one of the key mandate for the European Parliament, which the majority of this House has subscribed to. Another key issue for the European Union is, of course, migration, very similar to here. In one way or the other, the EU institutions need to look into the migration issue. And then we have, of course, the global threats, geopolitical issues such as China, misinformation, disinformation, foreign interference from Russia. This is of course also the context, but not only with the Russian aggression against Ukraine. These are the major topics, I would say. The last mandate was dominated by legislating on digital issues. There was the Digital Market, Digital Services Act adopted, the AI Act, the CHIPS Act, and it was the Green Deal, which was in the focus of the attention of the European Parliament, which was also the major piece of political priorities for the Ursula von der Leyen Commission. In this mandate, the Green Deal is still there, but it's a little bit less in the focus. You could also argue that we have done our homework. For the moment, there's no lack on Green Deal legislation. All this, what we called Fit for 55 legislation, is in place. We have the cars mandates, the aviation fuels, we have the heatings, we have the CO2 emission trading schemes, we have CBAM. So you could argue that the Green Deal legislation has been done and needs to be implemented now, in some ways a little bit, maybe a bit softened or a bit corrected. But that's not so much the priority anymore. And Ursula von der Leyen has proposed also a Clean Industrial Act policy paper, which shows you that the focus goes a bit from environment to industry. And on digital, I would also say, I mean, these acts like Digital Market, Digital Services Act are of great relevance, but they are now out there for implementation and enforcement, and not necessarily to put a second layer of legislation on top of it. I think I stop here. I have mentioned the main topics. I would be curious to hear a little bit what Markus thinks and what you think then. I'm sure I couldn't touch on everything, but this is just the opening. So back to you, Markus. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think I should have this up here.
Do you want to take a seat? So thank you very much for the sort of introduction of the complexity, as you can tell, as well as the many challenges, right? So I prepared a few questions that I want to ask you pertaining to the conference, especially, what can the European Parliament do actually to promote and maintain democracy internally in Europe, but also, of course, with regards to the US, right? You can imagine that's a pretty challenging environment right now. The old transatlantic relationship is, I don't want to call it dead, but it's pretty comatose right now, if you ask me. And so I think there are some questions that we want to have clarified, and then we'll open it up to your questions and comments, and I want to see what you think. Obviously, we've just seen, right, we don't need to put up the slide, but we've seen that there has been a shift in the last European Parliament election to the right? You've seen basically sort of the center-right together with the rightist bloc of party groups are dominating. What effect does this have for the maintenance of democracy in Europe, and maybe, if you want to say also a little bit, to democracy promotion across the world? Right? I'm thinking here of USAID cuts here that basically undercut democracy promotion.
You mean the shift to the right in the European Parliament?
The European Parliament, yeah.
Well, actually, as I explained a little bit, there is a shift to the right, but it's not a landslide. It's not a revolution. There are some 50, 60, 70 more votes now on the center right and on the center left that has been passed compared to the last mandate. It's true that in some instances this could shift majorities on some key legislation, like I mentioned, on environmental standard or on societal issues. But it's not near anything like the revolutionary way of shifting majorities. If in the United States it changes from Democrats to Republicans or back and forth between in a two-party system, because we have through this multi-party system a very strong culture of still finding compromises and trying to get also, as far as possible, not a narrow majority with 10 or 15 members more than the others, but to get 2/3, 3/4 majority through the parliament's votes. And secondly, I would say, even if there's a slight shift to the right, if the European People's Party being with 190 votes in the center of that camembert, that cake, I would say up to 70% of the European Parliament remains absolutely pro-European, pro-internal market, pro-euro currency, and pro-transatlantic, and pro-NATO, and pro-Ukraine. On these fundamentals, nothing has changed. Really nothing has changed. I don't see it deteriorating in a way that we throw all these kind of cornerstones, which I have just mentioned, in the bin. That is, the European Parliament remains also a very operational parliament, very workable. We have committee chairs across the political spectrum. We have rapporteurs across the political spectrum, vice presidents across the political spectrum, which gives incentives for all groups, except maybe the far-right groups, to work in a very proactive way in the European Parliament. So I'm not pessimistic, but rather optimistic that the European Parliament remains a good place for democracy. What we do to promote democracy abroad, I mean, that is something which is more soft power, of course. We cannot legislate on that, but it's an integral part of our foreign policy. The foreign policy, of course, is more in the hands of the executive arm of the European Union. That would be the High Representative Vice President Kallas. That's, of course, Ursula von der Leyen. That's also the Council, where the member states' foreign affairs ministers are acting together. But we have the Team Europe approach in the European Union, which means all three institutions should represent the European Union abroad with a single voice, ideally, and with the same shared values and democratic principles. And in a way, we also, as the European Parliament, we have quite a strong outreach to countries outside the European Union through our delegations, which we have. I mean, we have a delegation for relations with the United States. We have a delegation for relations with ASEAN.
Which is basically the equivalent of an embassy, right?
Yes.
EU embassy.
Yes, and in that regard, the European Parliament has election observation missions, which is in many parts of the world, in African countries or in South American countries, quite relevant that we send delegations to these countries to observe on the ground parliamentary elections and make sure that they are undertaken in an orderly way. So in that regard, the European Parliament, I think, can lead by example because we are a large multinational parliament with regular elections every 5 years, which were done in a quite orderly way.
Thank you. Thank you. So now I want to focus a little bit sort of on the transatlantic relationship, right? And as you've seen, or previously in previous years, decades, the European Parliament was the citizen-elected legislature for the Europeans, right? That was generally always very transatlantically minded, of course. Now we've seen over the last, decade maybe, also quite a polarization split among EU member states, right? On the one hand, you have a lot of still pro-European governments. You have the ones who are sort of tepidly embracing membership of the European Union, sort of a middle group. And then you have, of course, some outliers, you know, the newcomers, not newcomers, they're not that new, but I mean, Hungary, I'm thinking here of Hungary, Viktor Orban's Hungary, right? Or more recently, more importantly, Giorgia Meloni's Italy, right? And Giorgia Meloni is an interesting case because she's on the one hand sort of a nationalist, right, post-fascist prime minister of Italy, but also one that still embraces, to a certain extent, the European Union, embraces also the US, which of course, that's now a whole different game. So I'm just wondering, to what extent does sort of that split that we've seen most recently, last weekend, I think, when was it, the security declaration, the emergency council meeting of the European leaders, it was basically 26, right, against 1. They were not able to get Hungary on board, Viktor Orban. So to what extent do these splits impact, you know, transatlantic bridge building?
Well, Marcus, first of all, what you explained happens more in the Commission and in the Council, not so much in the Parliament. And I'm hesitating a little bit commenting on the other institutions. I would say the transatlantic relations as a key objective of the European Union remains. There is no doubt about that. I mean, you can have always different views on how to pursue transatlantic relations, but the European Parliament remains by a very large majority transatlantic, as does the Commission, as does the Council. So I'm not worried about that. That we have countries like Hungary who have different views on certain issues. That's clear. We had one country who left us. That's UK. We had also Brexit. That is the most significant way of expressing disapproval with being a member of the European Parliament. So far, we don't have any other member states who would think about leaving the EU. And
the opposite.
In the opposite, we have a lot of states who would still wish to join the EU. The Balkans, we have Croatia, we have Georgia and Moldova. I've mentioned already Ukraine. So I'm not too pessimistic about that. In the end, Europe has always been also strong in bringing all these different cultures together, you know. It's true that governments in Italy or Ukraine, in Hungary, have criticized some course of action which was taken at EU level. But on the other side, it brings also diversity views on the table, you know. And I'm not too pessimistic about that. Take for instance Ukraine. I mean, we had now 17 rounds of sanctions which were adopted against Russia, and all of them have been adopted by unanimity in the Council. Mm-hmm. All of them have been adopted with Hungary on board. It takes sometimes more time to negotiate that, and we have procedures also for member states who fail, for instance, to implement EU policies, or if there were an abuse of public money from the EU. We have procedures on that under the treaty, which are ongoing. You know? So
you're more optimistic, yeah?
I'm more optimistic, and on transatlantic relations as well, because the EU and the US, they have some 40% of global GDP. If you look at the ties which are between the EU and the US when it comes to economics, culture, family, history, it is so tight, and the geopolitical threats which we face together, upholding democracy, that I think by all divergent views, cannot be any doubt that the European Union, the 27 member states of the European Union and the United States of America will continue to work together. And that's also what I experienced from my work in Washington, D.C. We anyway are a non-partisan office. We are diplomats. We work with any government, and we are mainly in outreach to the U.S. Congress, the European Parliament's office, and I have no indication that the doors have been closed or that we don't get access anymore.
Can I ask you about this exactly? Because I mean, you're in DC right? Working with Congress in particular, but I heard that with the drastic changes, I mean, the fact that, you know, Marco Rubio doesn't really want to meet with any EU level, you know, policymakers. I mean, do you experience that in DC as well? Because you said like you don't really, I mean, that's what you indicated. And what strategies do you have as the European Parliament or as the European delegation, the embassy in DC, to kind of get access, right, to policymakers in Congress that are now very different than the previous 4 years?
Yeah, I mean, we need to take into account that we're just in the, is it the 6th or 7th week now of the new government since 20th of January?
Feels longer.
It feels
the 6 or 7 years.
It feels like it's longer because there was a lot of activity
right.
on the executive side, but it's still a very short period of time, which means not even all posts are yet filled in the administration, you know, with the hearings in the Congress. What we encounter for the moment at a typical administration like the State Department, the leadership is there and the non-political desk officers are there, but the middle part of the management has been missing in the last weeks. That's the directors and how do you call it, deputy assistants, etc. And without leadership being in place, it's a full understanding. It's also difficult to meet foreign counterparts, you know. So we have to have a little bit of understanding that government needs also some time to set up the new structures and bring the new people in place. We work mainly with the US Congress, and they are specifically with the House of Representatives. There, the majority has not changed. It remained Republican. Speaker Johnson has been re-elected as Speaker of the House. And the House of Representatives offices we reach out to, we continue to work with them, you know, both Democrats and both Republicans and Democrats. I would not say that there is much of a change there, although policymaking has been a bit more complicated now because the House is, of course, occupied with agreeing on a budget. It's of course, also understandably an inward-looking process. And many things which are high on the agenda of transatlantic relations now, such as tariffs or Ukraine support, military support to Ukraine, is not in the House of Representatives. It's in the administration. It's White House topics. You know? So we have to acknowledge that.
Right. Thank you. So amongst while talking about these topics, I mean, there are plenty of, right, sort of contentious topics with tensions in the transatlantic relationship between the Europeans and the Trump administration in the US. So climate change, right, that's there's a major divergence there. The whole discussion about applying tariffs to Europe, you know, or reciprocal tariffs. The EU wanting to regulate, you know, the more extreme big tech companies or the lack of their regulation. Any solutions to Ukraine? You see what's happening, right? If you read the news. Among those, which are, in your opinion, the most hardest ones to negotiate and try to find the consensus?
All of them are complicated.
That's a lot to take on. That's.
I mean, certainly, the trade and tariff issue is something which is something to. Again, it's not the Parliament which is predominantly negotiating it. It's not legislator. We have a transatlantic legislators dialogue, so we bring together members of European Parliament with the congressmen in the Congress, but the tariffs would be adopted by ultimately by the U.S. administration, by the trade representative, and on instruction of the president. That would need to be negotiated with the European Commission, where we have Commissioner Šefčovič in charge of trade now. And if we were to do countermeasures on trade, as long as it's not done by legislation, it's more done by Commission acts which are proposed for the Council to act. You know, but the trade is something which will be high on our radar screen. The European Union has the sole responsibility for trade. It's not in the hands of member states anymore. So the EU has the unique competence to adopt tariffs. Evidently, if you have an internal market, you cannot have different tariffs between France and Germany. And we have our tools. I mean, the European Union could very well adopt counter tariffs if the US were to adopt tariffs on the EU.
Similar to what Canada did.
Yeah. And then you take it from there and you see how you can negotiate it out. But tariffs are, in my opinion, harmful for our both economies. They will fuel inflation. They are harming our competitiveness vis-à-vis third parties like China or the rest of the world. So I don't think it's the right way of doing it, but the European Union would be ready to react if something like this were to be adopted on the US side.
Plus, correct me if I'm wrong, but I mean, the Europeans already employ millions of US workers, right? Particularly in the southern states. So I don't know if tariffs were to come, right? It would in fact hurt, European companies that are operating in the US, therefore endangering US jobs as well.
Exactly. I mean, the figures are well known about the jobs that depend on both sides, on companies which are engaged in both EU and the US. The other topic which you mentioned is, of course, Ukraine, which is for the European Union a very, very difficult situation that the war drags on now since 3 years. It's actually at the beginning of the 4th year. It's a catastrophic humanitarian situation in Ukraine, which the aggression of Russia against Ukraine has caused. The European Union stands with the Ukraine. We would like to have this war ended, but it needs to be ended so that there can be lasting peace. And it needs a security architecture in the Ukraine to avoid that anything like this happens again. For me, as a civil servant working for the European Union, it is particularly devastating to see what this Ukraine war is doing, what happens there, because the European Union was founded in the 50s, almost 80 years ago, on the ruins of the Second World War, particularly between Germany and France, but the 6 founding nations were Germany, France, Italy, Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg, in order to bring the steel and coal industries together, and later on, then with the internal market, all our services, goods, and economies, in such a way that never ever you would have a possibility to even imagine another war between Germany and France. So the EU, at the time it was the European Economic Community, was founded as a peace-building or peace-lasting project. That's the main reason, the real nub of the European Union is peace, basically, on the ruins of the Second World War. And that needs to be kept in mind, which is in the DNA of all European member states and all European civil servants and politicians, to avoid that such a war. And the Ukraine war happens not on EU territory, but it's a border state of the European Union. I mean, there are a number of EU member states who have a border to the Ukraine, which is quite. This is something which you need to see is quite dramatic for the European Union. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes, you mentioned then also the big tech regulations. Yes, that's of course something which is there. I mentioned already in my introductory remarks that this is now out for implementation. And climate change, yes, I mean, that's a joint challenge, which I mentioned, where we have to bring in now also the competitiveness of our industry. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. And then my last question, and then we open it up for you. You had a long career, obviously over 20 years or longer in the European institutions, covering a whole range of different areas. Mm-hmm. So what was sort of your most challenging time or project or experience, and what was the most satisfying one? If you want to share that a little bit more personal.
Well, I mean,
political.
That's not an easy question, Marcus.
I'm not here to ask.
20 years.
Sorry.
I would say the most challenging one, or in a way also satisfying, was before I took over this post in Washington as head of the European Parliament Liaison Office. I was 4 years the chief of staff of Transport Commissioner Adina Valian. We were in charge of transportation. And we were also in charge, evidently, when then on the 22nd of February in 2022, the Ukraine war broke out because Putin has invaded Ukraine overnight on that, a Friday to a Saturday on 22nd of February, 3 years ago. And as we were, I was not in the parliament, I was in the commission, which is an executive body. We were in charge of transportation. And while you would think a war in Ukraine is predominantly a foreign policy issue, it was also a transportation issue, because we had in the same night to clear the airspace over Ukraine, so that no civilian aircraft would have been shot down or got harmed by the war. That was something which had to happen in the first 3 or 4 hours to clear the airspace through our agencies, the German FAA, which is the aviation safety agency in Köln, and also Eurocontrol, to make sure that the civil aviation is safe in that night when the war broke out. And soon after, in the first couple of days, we had a massive inflow of refugees fleeing the war in Ukraine, which all came in through the border in Poland, in Slovakia, and also in Romania, Moldova, Romania. And that was a transportation issue, because those refugees, they came with any means across the border, and they needed to be transported away then from the Polish border. After a couple of weeks, there were hundreds of thousands of refugees stranded in Polish border region, and we had to organize with the railway companies, but also bus companies, the transport of those refugees away from the Polish border. And at the same time, we had to bring in humanitarian aid into the Ukraine, which is also another transportation issue. So in a way, what I helped as Chief of Staff of Transport Commissioner there was to make sure that the immediate reaction from the transport side was done in an orderly way, in a European-wide, also harmonized way, so that we don't run in Poland in different directions, like in Romania and Germany and Netherlands. In the beginning, nobody knew how many refugees could be taken in where. It was quite a chaotic situation also. And later on, then, it was absolutely necessary to organize the whole goods transport into the Ukraine and out of the Ukraine on a completely new basis, because Ukraine is one of the largest agricultural producer in the world, maybe after the United States, but for European, very, very relevant. And a lot of grain, particularly food, which is produced in Ukraine, was historically exported through the Black Sea corridor to African countries or Middle East countries. So in a way, Ukraine is the corn chamber of the corn supplier of Egypt or Sudan. And that transport roads have been blocked because Russia has put mines into the Black Sea. The port of Odessa was under fire, and it was not possible anymore to export anything out of the Ukraine towards the standard roads through the ports in the Black Sea. So what we did then in those first weeks of the Ukraine war is, with all our coordination power, which the European Commission has, to organize land transport, grain transport out of Ukraine through Poland, through to Germany, to the ports in the Baltic Sea, or to the Mediterranean, to the Adriatic coast, which was a challenge. To give you one example, Ukraine has not the same rail gauges than the European Union, so you had to have transshipment equipment at the borders to help exporting these goods out of the Ukraine. And you had also, evidently, as it was not a member state, you had to take away the tariffs and all the phytosanitarian checks and everything. So this kind of crisis management, which we did in the first week of the Ukraine war, is something, to your question, which I think was the most challenging, but also most rewarding in my career in the last years.
That's beautiful. Thank you. Thank you very much for insights. I think, 6 o'clock. So we still have, 20, 25 minutes for questions. So now if you have a question or comment, ideally a question, please go to the mic that's there in the middle. Very quickly say who you are, and then pose the question. Appreciate it. Yes. I think it should work, right?
Now it is.
Yes, perfect.
Okay.
Very good.
My name is Armando Pita. I'm a master's student, Global Affairs, Cybersecurity, and Tech Policy. Thank you again for this, and I think we should have more of these in general and more other local communities, because I feel like this forum is very important to hear about other issues in other countries and kind of bring us all together, because I think that's super important. And again, thank you for having us here. In light of Vice President J.D. Vance's recent remarks at the AI Action Summit, how does the European Union plan to balance the need for AI innovation with regulatory measures while ensuring that such regulations do not inherently infringe upon democratic values like freedom of speech?
Yes, Shall I react?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yes, I mean, I'm not sure that was much about the AI. It was on the AI summit, but he didn't mean so much the AI regulation. I think it was more about the Digital Market and Digital Services Act. I mean, we Europeans have the slightly different approach from the US. We go early on with regulation if we see threats to society, for instance. And the Digital Market and Digital Service Act, or the AI regulation, addresses these threats through this new technology. It could be consumer protection, it could be child protection in the internet, all kind of things which we try to prevent through our regulations. We do not regulate everything. I mean, when it comes to AI, for instance, about 2% of the business models around artificial intelligence are considered to be high-risk business models, such as face recognition or these kind of things, and those are regulated by the AI Act. But 98% or 95% of the AI applications, which are completely harmless but useful for the economic activities, they are not regulated. So I think we need to give these laws a little bit of time to be implemented now and to have its value, and then we will see how useful they are. I mean, the Digital Market Act and the Digital Service Act, particularly the Digital Market Act, is also there to prevent monopolies, to squeeze out small companies, SMEs, and prevent innovation also in a way, you know. So I think we have a lot of companies in Europe who applaud the EU for this kind of legislation, particularly smaller companies, because they get better away with the monopolies of the big players, the so-called gatekeepers. The way I would say this regulation is something which should be seen as useful and could be a lead model also for other regions in the world to take. I think they are not designed to prevent freedom of speech. The freedom of speech is one of the founding principles of the EU. I mean, this is one of the most important fundamental right in our treaties and all our 27 member states' national constitutions. So I don't see that is that much at stake here.
Please, if you have, yes, thank you so much. Dr. Ilcheva.
Good evening. Thank you for this very engaging and illuminating discussion. Now, my question links the two topics that we have in the title here, and it's more focused on Europe than transatlantic relations or Ukraine in particular. So in many ways, people consider, or the European Parliament bills itself as probably the most democratic institution because it has elected members. Yet, generally, voter turnout is pretty low for the parliamentarians. Mm-hmm. And especially from the newer or the newest members, where we see, you know, that civic engagement, that civil society is not yet connecting with the European Parliament. So my question is, how does the European Parliament deal with that issue? Are there any specific initiatives related to I don't know, civic education, civic engagement? Are they targeted towards the newer members? And are they targeted towards specific groups, especially the younger members of each society?
Do you mean to increase the participation in elections?
Yes, because if you look at voter turnout, Croatia is at the very bottom, obviously, for obvious reasons. But my own country, I'm Bulgarian, only about a third voter turnout for the European Parliament. So
yes.
That's what the question refers.
Yes, indeed. I mean, the European Parliament's administration and political leadership, we had a clear priority to increase the participation in the European elections as much as possible last year. And my own office, we were involved in even to reach out to European citizens living in the United States of America, like you, to help them with information through our embassies and particularly the general consulates which we have across the country to stimulate participation even from here. Sometimes it's possible per letter voting, sometimes per digital, and in some countries like Italy, I think it's not at all possible. You have to physically go, or Malta, you know. So it's not an easy task to increase election participation, but in the European Union, we had a large election participation campaign undertaken by the European Parliament, supported by the other institutions, also by the Commission, by the Council, and by all member states, in order to reach out to citizens and to raise awareness. The participation was something like 50%. It did stay stable. It didn't go up, but it also didn't go down further. So we have to live with that. Here in the United States, participation is not that much higher. And it's still a very democratic country. It's democratic decision. You said the most democratic institution. I think all parliaments which are directly elected are most democratic institutions. We are not better than that, but also not worse. We have been a bit at the limits. We cannot do much more from the administration to increase participation. I think there's also a structural issue. I mean, sometimes the European Parliament elections fall in some countries individually, not together with national parliaments or with regional parliaments elections, and then the motivation is lower to go to go to the ballot box. And it's also, I mean, we struggle in the European Union with the distance to the voter, evidently. I mean, 27 member states, 440 million citizens, all the way down, you know, from the EU level to the federal level to the state level to the regional level to the local level. So that is something which has been discussed by politicians and academics for decades. All things have been discussed upside down, but it's a matter of fact that a large portion of the citizens just don't get motivated to go for European elections, you know. Maybe over time, with these kind of things like the Ukraine war or some fundamental threats we are facing, which Markus has mentioned, in principle, knowing that about 80% of the economic activities in the European Union are defined by EU legislation. You don't go to a hotel, book a hotel, take a flight, fuel your car, go your grocery, right? Everywhere is EU legislation in one way or the other enshrined, because it's so fundamentally, the internal market is so fundamentally designed that you have often things which happen in Europe which go back to EU legislation, which are national legislation because directives which are transposed, etc. So we can only continue to raise awareness and make this case heard, so that in principle everybody should know this and the election turnout should be higher. But we also don't have a system of mandatory election. In some countries there is, like in Belgium, you have to, if you don't go, you would be fined. But we don't want to go down that route. In the end, a democratic vote is also a democratic act of voluntary participation or not, you know.
Thank you. If I may just very add on, I think also you're also referring to the fact that some of the more polarizing parties on the left or right, they seem to be more successful because they're more engaged on social media, right? Where a lot of young people get their news where they are being engaged. And I think this is probably one of the challenges that I could see for the European Parliament too, right? A very institutionalized body, to be more, I don't know, social media entrepreneurial, right? In that sense.
I didn't comment on that because I'm representing the institution, not parties. Different parties have different strategies how to reach out to vote on. That's a good right. That's democracy. What we did, we also did a social media campaign, but a neutral one. Be aware there's the European Parliament elections on that date. You have your vote, go to vote and make use of your vote. That was our, and that is, of course, of limited attractivity, you know. Yeah. That's a matter of fact, but we cannot go any step further because then we would enter into party politics, which we strictly don't do.
Thank you. Yes, please. All right.
Great. Thank you very much. My name is Aaron Rosen. I'm with the World Affairs Council of Miami. Thank you both for doing this. And quick plug for your office. When I was in grad school in D.C., I was an intern at the EPLO office.
Oh, super.
It was a bit different then. They sent us to Brussels afterwards for like a fellowship with the European Parliament.
But it changed your life, obviously.
It was a wonderful experience, and without exaggeration, it was life-changing. And so any students interested in transatlantic affairs, I can speak to it personally. It was a really wonderful program. and a great chance to learn both DC and the transatlantic relationship. So strongly recommend it. And I think it still is paid. It was paid then as well. So
it's paid, yes.
Yes,
We still
yeah.
have the same trainees.
So any students thinking about that, it's a really great way to enter into the field and to learn about the EU and the transatlantic relationship. Plug aside, question about kind of the atmosphere of the transatlantic relationship in DC right now. So obviously there was mention about how the State Department is not necessarily super engaged with the EU at the highest levels at the moment, but your office deals with the Congress and has very close relations with especially members of Congress from both parties that are in the transatlantic legislators dialogue and all these different bodies that are interested in the relationship. I'm wondering, and you don't have to name any names, of course, but if you could offer some insights into maybe some of the personal anecdotes of how you're seeing the transatlantic relationship on the legislative side at the moment, and if you can compare that to kind of how you're seeing that on the executive branch side, it could be an interesting insight to kind of where some members are thinking about the relationship and its trajectory. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you first for reminding the traineeship. I mentioned it already in the group when we spoke with students a couple of hours ago. Indeed, we have a traineeship program. Just go on EPLO, European Parliament Liaison Office, Washington D.C. traineeship. Those who are interested, it's an easy application process, goes directly to us. It doesn't go to Brussels. We have 4 trainees every 6 months. It's a 5-month paid traineeship. You only need to prepare a CV, a biography in our European format. That's maybe the main challenge. And then send an email, and you have to have a bachelor. It's a post-degree traineeship. We cannot take in students which are undergraduated. Well, with Congress, look, I mean, what we do is we try to establish good contacts into the offices of the House of Representatives, as I said, both sides, Democrats and Republicans, across the committees and all the topics, you know. There's no focus only on foreign affairs, etc. We go also economics, agriculture, budget, everything. For us at our level, it is very fruitful to get in contact with staffers on the Hill. These legislative directors or communication, chief of staffs, communication advisors who work for congressmen, and try to reach them out. We have a few very nice programs running there, like the Happy Hour on the Hill, where we sponsor some beers on the Hill in the Rayburn building, where then they can just pass by and grab a beer. We bring the ambassador there, or sometimes a politician from Europe, or just amongst us. Because I think in the end, diplomacy depends on personal contacts and friendships, even if you can use that word in the in the professional context. And then you can also shoot an email or call and say, I have a delegation coming in, would need a meeting, is congressman in town or not? So I think at that level it works very well, and there was no change through the election whatsoever. Another opportunity is to go through the so-called caucuses. I mean, there's the European caucus, there's a Portuguese caucus, there's a Romanian caucus. These are members who are affiliated to certain European regions or the EU as such, which is a very, very well functioning, because then if you have an issue which concerns Portugal, for instance, and you go to a member from the Portugal caucus, it's a very, very good access to the congressman. The third thing is our transatlantic legislators dialogue, which is institutionalized. That is a chair on the European side and a co-chair, a Republican Democrat on the US side, where we have regular meetings since '79, since it's the 89th or 90th meeting coming up now, where we always get some 6 or 8 congressmen and some 10 or 15 members of European Parliament on the other side. Last meeting was in Texas in November, which was very fruitful exchange. And this is also irrespective of the new majorities. This is continuing engagement. What helps very much is engaging on topics, concrete topics. When the European Parliament legislated on the AI Act, we had a Romanian rapporteur, Dragos Tudorake from the Renew Group, who was a very, very active, outspoken member of European Parliament, who was 4 or 5 times in Washington, D.C. in those crucial months when the AI Act was legislated and negotiated between the Parliament and the Council. in the European Union, and he has met here in Washington with lawmakers on the Hill, but also with think tanks, NGOs. And he brought a topic. He said, I'm in charge of AI. We are about to regulate. We have our criteria, what is risky AI, what do we want to do, how do we define this 2% which we want to ban, and how do we want to define the 98% which we want to stimulate. And the best thing what can happen is that these kind of topics are raised with the US Congress in the run-up of legislation while it's still in the making, and hearing the respective mutual voices and opinions on it instead of legislating and putting on your table, on your feet, and then see how it goes. So these are the recipes for success, I think, bringing concrete topics or bringing another element which helps us to have good outreach to US Congress is going through district. I mean, all those congressmen, men and women, they have a district here in California, maybe here in this wonderful Miami, or in Texas. And then they might have companies there which have a European leg or a lot of constituents, like Polish people in Chicago. And suddenly, if you bring Polish members and you say, let's reach out to Chicago, these are also which works very well, you know. But after all, I think the European Union has and remains a key player for the US Congress. Everybody understands the economics and the ties, the close ties we have, and the shared values and the shared challenges, and it has not changed in my view.
Thank you. I think we have time for 2 more questions, so for the 2 of you here, please. Thank you.
My name is Francisco Munoz. I work in the humanitarian sector, specifically disaster management. I'm an alumni of the Academy of International Disaster Preparedness. My question is in reference, now that we are seeing the largest migration globally ever, post-World War II included, and you're seeing the weaponization of migration, like we saw in Belarus and the Polish border, and there's many other examples. My question is, and I apologize, so UN definitions of refugees, migrant, and internally displaced persons create legal and bureaucratic distinctions that can delay or restrict humanitarian assistance. Given the growing complexity of displacement due to conflict, climate change, economic instability, how can the European Parliament work with international partners to ensure that these classifications do not hinder urgent and delivery and protection for vulnerable populations? Thank you.
Well, working with international organizations is probably more for executive arms than for the European Parliament. The European Parliament would typically legislate on migration. If it is legislation or monitor via the accountability what the European Commission is doing on migration. Migration is indeed probably one of the most serious issues for the European Union currently. Don't want to put it in really a priority list with Ukraine war and competitive economy, but I'm seriously convinced that we have to find solution on migration issues in a way which reassures an orderly handling of incoming refugees, the pressure of incoming refugees, and at the same time respond to humanitarian needs and to the values of protecting also displaced people, refugees from the war, and etc. If we don't get this extremely difficult policy area right in the next years to come, and you can see this in local elections, in national elections in the European Union, we will be right at the title of this conference about the democratic value and the civic participation. We will see people voting more and more in the extremes. Extreme right or extreme left might be under the horseshoe thing in the end, more or less with the same result. And then you get parties in power, or at least in strong numbers in parliaments, which throw other things into the bin, which are at the same time very useful and important for our democracies, such as rules of law, fundamental rights, human rights, or other things which are so fundamental for our societies. How to find the right answer on migration? I mean, the European Union is struggling since years. The Commission in the last 5 years has presented a huge package of asylum compact and trying to align the policies in the European Union better. We have proposed legislation on a more coordinated return of refugees, of those who are illegal in the European Union, a more coordinated taking over of refugees, a burden sharing within the 27 member states, a more coordinated reaction at the border, better border protection also, very similar to discussion going on here. But all of this has so far seen limited impact on the ground, because the European Union is not a state. We are just a supranational organization. In the end, we depend on member states to implement. We have member states, police forces and border police to implement it. And a lot of things are a little bit also beyond the control of a single EU member state. We have an internal market, for instance. We have the rule that refugees, if they seek asylum in the European Union, they should be treated and remain in that country where they enter the European Union. That's in most cases, for instance, Greece. But you cannot put them in prison, you cannot detain them, you know. But between Greece and Germany, there's no real border anymore. I mean, there's this Balkan, but take Italy as an example. You can take in Italy a bus, a Flixbus, you go to Germany or go France. There's no border control. There is no possibility to control these kind of things. And refugees go often there where families are. We have a large Syrian community now in Germany since 2015. So new incoming Syrian refugees, they want to go to Germany, or maybe they want to go to Germany because in Germany they have the highest, in their view, social protection, which is not an EU issue. You know, this is national competence, whether you get full or only half social protection as a refugee, or medical treatment and housing and training, language courses and all these kind of things. So as we have these divergent member states, societal or political situations, and we have so far had often a lack of implementation of the legislation which is in place, I think we need to look in implementation rather than new legislation.
And it seems counterintuitive, because the ones that are going to take the biggest brunt are the ones closest to the border. And then as soon as they hop over, and it's creating this chaotic mess that even international nonprofits have an issue with, because we're beholden to our, to our beneficiaries, and they're going to be very specific and pigeonhole us sometimes.
Yeah, I take good note of this. I myself not an expert too much on the definition of under the refugee or migration legislation, but
sounds like a Dublin problem.
It sounds like a serious problem. I'll take this with me and have a look. Yes, thank you.
And last but not least, thank you.
Just a brief question. Thank you, Dr. Goetz. I'm Beverly Barrett. We met earlier. I have a question on education and for students. I mentioned studying in Bologna. I've researched the Bologna process and higher education recognition in Europe. But before the Bologna process was Erasmus, which was so popular, and now there's Erasmus Plus opportunities for students from beyond Europe.
Right, Erasmus, right, is the Europe-wide study abroad program whereby students can go to study in another country for 6 months to a year and receive EU funding.
Right. And so I wanted to ask you, how is that activated in Europe, and are there opportunities for American students, or what can you say to encourage Americans or anyone from around the world to come to Europe, because that's so much about understanding transatlantic relations. Through
you mean if American students could be
or any of these
Erasmus
students
in Europe?
Right. Or opportunities,
I don't know
how Erasmus is going and growing, because I think it's one of the most popular aspects of the
It is very
European
popular,
Union.
and Erasmus is one of the nicest or finest example of how the European Union is doing something good by financing with the humble means, and there's also a limit there, but these exchanges among students across Europe. And I know that third countries can participate in Erasmus if they pay for it, evidently. you have to contribute to the EU budget, and But I don't know if US is part of Erasmus.
There is, I mean, as somebody who is involved in EU grant making, yes, under Erasmus Plus, so that includes also countries around the world. But you have to get in a grant agreement with European institutions. And then you're able to receive EU funding even as an American student. We do have here, for example, at FIU, just to give you an idea, we do have about, I would say, 4 to 5 Erasmus Plus agreements with European universities that then allows American students to go. However, many of our students wouldn't even know about it. I hardly know, which ones those are, and then it's always between specific departments, right? So it may be for, FIU chemistry students, but we, at least in our field, politics and international relations, we should have more Erasmus Plus. I'm always trying to get that going together with Madame Kali, but unfortunately we were not able to get more. But it's a great opportunity.
Yeah.
And I think within Europe, there are millions of European students have used already over the last 30 years Erasmus. I think probably a few of you here have been beneficiaries of the Erasmus
Within
program.
the EU, it's very easy, yes, but within the EU 27, I think even with UK, it came to a halt after Brexit.
Yeah, which is, I think, it just got restarted.
Working on to restart it. It's possible if, I think Switzerland is part of it because they pay, but yeah.
So
as he said, I myself, I'm not an expert on this Erasmus thing when it comes to the US.
So we wanted to stop at 6:30 and leave it to the Germans, right, at 6:30. So with that being said, please help me give a big hand of applause to Dr. Goetz. Thank you very much for coming here and sharing your wisdom. A little something for you so that you remember FIU, but also this is a very sort of fun little book about the differences between Europe and the US.
The US.
Yeah. So thank you very much. For the ones of you who have RSVP'd, right, we have a reception now following, so please just enjoy yourself. Hopefully you'll be able to answer a few more questions sort of more conversationally outside. Of course, I'll be around too, and thank you very much for coming. Also a reminder that tomorrow, in case you're interested, we have a whole day of course, now we should have a agenda. We have a whole day of great panels from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. tomorrow in SIPA 2, room 260. And then, Christine, what are you telling me? Oh, there's a QR code. So please look at the QR code where you can find all the information. Sorry, I'm so from the 20th century, apparently. So thank you very much again for coming.
Thank you
very
for
much.
your interest and your staying. Thank you.
Thank you. That was good. We covered a lot of ground.